Dear fashion students, we need to talk.
No comments.
Just so for context, the way we work, we have one box from this semester. Literally,
Yes.
I've emptied it once maybe. And this is what they have. Maybe a shirt from last semester as well. This is someone's doll from last project. But this is not okay because there's a bunch of puff inside and we are reusing all of this. So this is what ends up in trash. A giant freaking piece of mesh which can be used a million times more. It's clean, it's unused, no stains, no rips, nothing on it.
Here's actually a knitter.
Yeah.
So like in iTkani, they sell in online Tkani, they sell these pieces in the basket.
Yeah,
for
leftover
600
scraps.
rubles, 600 rubles.
Alice is getting ready for a party. Babushka, look.
Fashion is one of the most polluting industries in the world. Now, I'm not going to be sitting here telling you all the problems about it because you probably already know them because you can't really escape them in the 21st century. But I'm going to be leaving a bunch of links down below if you're interested to read about them in case you actually don't know much about it. But today I'm going to be talking a more narrow subject within the field. Since you study fashion, you know that this is not frivolous, it's not unimportant, but for those who don't, let me give you a bit of an outline. Fashion is valued more than $2.4 trillion annually, and 1 of 6 jobs is tied to the industry in some capacity. If you believe that fashion is superficial and you're just wearing clothing to cover up your body, you're still making a choice. You're picking clothing to express yourself. In your case, you're picking clothing to express your lack of interest in such an unserious matter as fashion, which is an engagement with fashion in itself. Fashion is a form of humanity which is instinctual in all of us and is a form of self-expression and freedom of thought. What's more is that fashion as an art form has the intense power to evoke social transformation and experiment with ideas of sexuality and body image. We as designers have the unique power to convey any message Ubuntu design development in the process of research. And if that message is in any way, shape or form connected to politics, to social questions, to anything controversial, we have the power to unite people, to lead them, to resonate with them, because fashion is a visual tool that goes way beyond pretty clothing. But if a designer chooses to only focus on one side of the question, we have a problem. The fashion industry as we know it is obsolete. It is no longer what we 20-something-year-olds grew up watching on TV. The poor Anne Hathaways of the world from Del West Prada don't need to lose weight just because they're being laughed at, which is very problematic in itself, but the world has changed and so has the industry. You have to realize that we as future fashion designers have the responsibility to convey a message which would leave no negative impact on people, be it emotional, physical or environmental. Everything we do matters, from fabrics we choose, to design construction, to the models that we choose to represent our final pieces. Every little detail constructs your philosophy. And if you still believe that throwing a giant piece of fabric out to recycling is a way of engaging in sustainable fashion, then I'm sorry, but you're wrong. In our group, for example, we collect every little scrap of fabric and put it into one box on the table for us to later use as padding, as samples, as, I don't know, like patchwork pieces or anything. I'm sure, unfortunately, that this is not the case in every university that does fashion, and that's kind of what's scaring me. There's a lot of talk about fashion designers once they graduate and their responsibility to engage in sustainable fashion, but there's not exactly enough emphasis on it and to how the universities are being structured. We as students at British High School of Art and Design in Moscow do have a specific subject, a specific project that we're working on in sustainability, but I think it's very difficult for a fashion designer to graduate and be engaging in the sustainable fashion world when you're not exactly being taught and explained how it works while you're studying it on the course. I know there are a lot of universities that actually do have a lot of emphasis on it, and I know that some students are actually suffering about it because they're feeling the limitations on their projects and their creativity, but obviously there has to be a specific balance which we should focus on. But for now I want to tell you how recycling fabrics is the absolute last step you should be taking. I realize that this is probably one of the first things that come to mind for a fashion student when you're talking about sustainability in fashion, but that is actually the last step, as in general in life when you're talking about sustainability. Recycling is the last step you should be taking. The only fabrics that can be recycled into their original form, although not indefinitely, are 100% synthetics. I know this goes kind of against with the thought of sustainability, all the synthetic fabrics like nylon or polyester, but the subject is controversial in general. Now I'm going to be reading off the screen so that I don't misinterpret any information. Polyester is a byproduct of oil industry which is made from carbon-intensive non-renewable resource. Petroleum products are used as raw materials to make the fiber and also to generate the energy needed to manufacture. More than 70 billion barrels of oil are used to make polyester each year. It is not biodegradable and will persist in the ecosystem even as it eventually breaks apart. In fact, it is believed that synthetic garments are the biggest source of microplastic pollution in the oceans. Although it is less energy intensive than nylon to produce, it still requires more than double the energy of conventional cotton to produce. Blended fibers can be recycled, but they lose quality, which is why you won't see 100% recycled materials, but instead about 20% mixed in with other fibers, with a small exception of recycled plastic bottles. Recycled denim is shredded and blended with virgin cotton, so it still uses raw materials in its production. So obviously I've just mentioned 3 different things you would probably be thinking about in fabric sourcing, so either raw natural fabrics, raw synthetic fabrics, or a blend, all 3 of which are problematic for different reasons. And I know the list goes on and it's frankly quite overwhelming. Which is why I'm not asking you to entirely change your working process, and I'm not trying to ask you to stop buying fabrics. What I am asking you is to be a bit more mindful about your approach to work. So I'm going to be showing you a little list of things you could try to make. First would be quite obvious. When placing your patterns onto a piece of fabric, try and position them with the smallest amount of gaps in between so that you waste less fabric. Number 2 is saving your offcuts and kind of keeping them on around the table to use as samples, to use as padding, to use as patchwork in the future. You can always repurpose things, even the smallest ones. Number 3 is keeping a box of fabrics for communal use. For example, I found myself collecting a bunch of fabrics donated from other people. At the start of the project, I thought I would have one color palette, and now I have a completely different one. So there are a bunch of fabrics that I'm not going to be using in this project, which I am definitely going to recycle later on, but just kept them in the communal box so that anyone could take them in their current project, so that I could save a bit of money for them, or a bit of don't know, bit of raw materials, so that they don't have to buy anything new if I have it and I'm not using it in this project. So we have a communal box of fabrics. Number 4 would be buying natural materials as much as possible, although cotton is a very thirsty material. If you can, go for organic cotton, but natural fabrics in general, if you're not blending them with anything, if you're sewing with also natural threads, that is important. If you're sewing natural materials with natural threads and you're not adding any garments, this will be quite an easy thing to recycle later on, even though that's the last step and you would like to produce it as good quality as possible so that the thing will be worn millions of times before it gets recycled. If you make it a very natural piece, that's going to be a bit easier to recycle later on. As fashion designers, you obviously know what toiles are, but if you're not a fashion designer, toiles are the samples, the test things that we make before we make a final piece. So we probably construct it generally kind of the same as you would make the final piece, so we have like a full-scale toiles samples of our future garments. Once you've submitted your toiles and you no longer need them, you can just take them apart and use every little bit of it. Because, for example, in here we have an example of someone's toile from level 5. They have taken a whole giant jacket which is filled with synthetic padding and they've thrown it into a box for recycling. Jesus Christ, you can reuse it. Just think about the future, think about next upcoming projects, or think about your next year's degree collection. Someone is definitely going to be using padding. Like, you have 20 people in your group, probably one of those is going to be using padding, and you could save them a little bit of money. You can save the world from a little bit of padding going into recycling and a bit of energy of recycling that padding. Just think a year in advance, even a couple of months in advance. Just think a little bit more than about your current project. If you are enthusiastic about things, if you are a bit more engaged into sustainable fashion, you could organize a fabric swap, which is essentially same as clothing swap, just bring your necessary fabrics and trade with someone. If you have a large university, like ours is quite small, we only have 3 years of fashion, maybe if your university is way bigger than ours and you have different courses like textile, menswear, women's wear, knitwear, like a billion ones like in CSM or larger fashion schools, you could organize a textile swap, and that would be probably beneficial for someone, like sustainability wise obviously, but someone might need a piece of fabric that you no longer need and you don't want to store in your house or in your locker and you don't have space for it. I think that could be very beneficial. The next one, if your design is complicated, if you have a bunch of little details, if it's constructed of different fabrics, try to go for the same fabrics in terms of quality. If they are all synthetics, go for 100% synthetics. So you could choose same kind of quality, not mixing just piece of cotton with piece of synthetic, piece of a blend. That would be very difficult to recycle. So try to think about where your garment is going to end up in after it wears down, after it's being used and it has to go into recycling. Think a bit further into the end point of your garment when you're constructing it. And then last one would be buying secondhand or repurposing things. it's not as hard. For example, in my current projects, because I'm thinking about using leather, I definitely don't want to buy genuine leather, new leather from the stores, because that will be kind of me supporting the industry, which I'm kind of on the fence about reusing leather, natural leather. So I just bought myself a giant leather coat from Avito from someone else, so it's a second-hand coat, which is quite old in itself, but I can reuse it and make something new out of it from a coat which nobody would probably wear. So reuse, buy from Avito. A lot of people have rolls of fabric which they're not using, so if you want to use something new, unused, even that exists on Avito, it's just been lying around someone's flat for a while and not being used, so maybe that is helpful for you. I'm sure there's a lot of other things that could be added to this list, but I think these ones are the easiest ones to introduce into your daily life if you're not really interested in sustainability at the moment. I know there are a bunch of limiting factors, such as maybe location, access to good quality fabrics, cost as well, because most of us are living from our parents' money and they're paying for our school, which is quite a privilege in itself. So thanks to them, the least we can do is to engage in sustainability in some capacity. So you could just look into one of the things that I just gave an example in here, or think about something of your own to take a little bit of a step towards being more sustainable as a designer.